The man in the apron. The rain drizzled lightly on the sidewalks of Menlo Park, a quiet Tuesday morning giving way to the rush of the day. Mark Zuckerberg, dressed in his usual understated hoodie and jeans, walked through the doors of a local McDonald's. It wasn't part of a press tour, no business meeting, and certainly no publicity stunt. Just a tech billionaire grabbing a cup of black coffee before heading back to Meta's campus for another full day of AI roadmap discussions. But as Mark stood in line, his presence almost completely unrecognized by the early morning crowd, he glanced toward the kitchen. Behind the counter, moving with precision and politeness, was a young man wearing the telltale McDonald's cap and apron. His name tag read Ayan. There was something about him that struck Mark. Not his face, not his voice, but his eyes. Focused, calculated, and thoughtful. As Mark took a seat in the corner with his coffee, he watched as Ayan helped a mother carry her tray to the table, smiled warmly at a homeless man asking for a cup of water, and coached a nervous teenage cashier through a complicated order. He wasn't just working, he was leading, and it felt familiar. The familiar spark Mark couldn't shake the feeling. He opened his laptop, sipping his coffee as emails and Slack notifications began flooding his screen. But still, he looked up at Ayan every so often. There was something about him that resonated. Finally, as Ayan took a short break, Mark stood and approached. "Hey," Mark began casually. "I don't mean to intrude, but do I know you?" Ayan paused, a flicker of recognition flashing in his eyes before he quickly hid it behind a polite smile. No, sir. I don't think so." "I just work here," he replied. Mark chuckled. "I work not too far from here myself. Meta, ever heard of it?" Ayan smiled, his expression faltering for just a split second. "Yeah, I know it. Used to know it better." That's when Mark knew. Once a coder over the next few minutes, the story began to unfold. Ayan had once been a Meta engineer, part of a promising internal team working on a little-known project, an ethical AI framework aimed at increasing transparency in algorithmic content delivery. He'd graduated top of his class at Stanford, been headhunted straight into Meta, and for a while, things were golden, but life had different plans. Ayan's father, a diabetic, had suffered a stroke just months into Ayan's tenure. His younger sister, barely a teenager, was diagnosed with scoliosis. Bills piled up, and their family insurance had loopholes. The stress became unbearable. He tried to juggle it all. Meta's high-stakes environment, 16-hour coding sprints, and caring for a fragile household. Eventually, Ayan made a choice many wouldn't understand. He left, no notice, no explanations. He walked out of Menlo Park, not out of weakness, but for love. Now he was flipping burgers to make ends meet, smiling through long shifts, studying code at night on a beat-up laptop in the back room, all while keeping his family afloat. Mark was stunned and deeply moved. The quiet heroism as Ayan finished his break and went back to the kitchen. Mark sat back down in the corner booth, stirred. He thought about everything he'd just heard. Not from a TED Talk, not from a polished LinkedIn profile, but from a young man in a grease-stained apron. It made him reflect on how easily the world overlooks quiet heroes. People who don't go viral, who don't write Medium posts or tweet threads. People like Ayan, who silently choose sacrifice over self-promotion. Mark began typing. He wasn't sure what he was doing yet. But something had to come of this. This wasn't just a moment. It was a story waiting to be told. A truth about perseverance, love, and grit in the face of invisible odds. And Meta, with all its resources and innovation, had a role to play. Reaching. Out 2 days later, Ayan got a call. It was from an unknown number. "Hi, Ayan. This is Elise from Meta's People Ops team. We'd love to invite you for coffee with Mark this Friday, if you're open to it." Ayan froze. He'd been quietly rebuilding his life, not expecting anything more than getting through each day. But something told him to say yes. That Friday, at a serene cafe just a few blocks from Meta HQ, he sat across from Mark Zuckerberg, not as an applicant, not as an employee, but as a human being with a story worth hearing. What it means to build. Mark didn't pitch Ayan a job. Not yet. Instead, they talked for hours about everything from the fragility of modern life to the future of AI ethics, about coding from cafes, dreaming of impact, and what it really meant to move fast and break things, including sometimes ourselves. It was during that conversation that Mark said something that stayed with Ayan forever. You didn't walk away from Meta. You walked towards something more important. But you never stopped building. That's the difference. A door reopened. Over the next few weeks, Ayan was brought back, not as an employee, but as a co-creator. Mark asked him to join a new stealth project, a social impact incubator under Meta's umbrella, aimed at supporting underserved talent in tech. Engineers who'd left the path, people with stories, second-chance brilliance. Ayan would help build it from the ground up. His days of flipping burgers weren't forgotten. They were foundational, and now he was bringing others with him. Rebuilding the blueprint, Ayan stepped through the grand glass doors of Meta's Innovation Annex with a mixture of awe and anxiety. Though it had only been 2 years since he last walked into a Meta building, it felt like an entire lifetime had passed. The halls still buzzed with the electric hum of breakthroughs in progress. Engineers scribbled on whiteboards with the same intensity he once carried in his fingertips, and ambitious interns darted through corridors, chasing deadlines like lightning bugs. But Ayan wasn't here to return to the same Meta. He wasn't coming back to reclaim a desk or prove he still belonged. He had been called here for something entirely different. To rebuild, not just his own career, but the way the world saw opportunity and talent. His new role, as loosely defined as it was, existed at the intersection of innovation and empathy. Mark had carved out a space, a skunkworks lab dedicated not to products but to people. This wasn't about optimizing ad revenue or launching the next iteration of virtual meetings. This was about discovering brilliance in broken places, designing pathways for people whose talents had been overlooked because life got in the way. It was about creating a pipeline to tech that didn't just run through Ivy League hallways or elite boot camps, but through shelters, minimum wage jobs, war zones, and kitchens behind fast food counters. On his first day, Ayan was given a small office with a single potted plant on the windowsill and a stack of resumes, each belonging to someone whose story mirrored his own in some way. A mother of 3 who coded at night while cleaning hospital floors during the day. A refugee from Syria who'd been building open-source libraries from an internet cafe. A man just released from prison who had taught himself Python through a donated textbook in solitary confinement. These weren't just profiles, they were stories, they were lives. And suddenly, Ayan saw the full arc of his own journey, not as a detour, but as preparation. Every shift at McDonald's, every moment he spent debugging code at 3 a.m., while his father struggled to sleep in the next room, had shaped him for this moment. He got to work with a quiet fury, drawing from both his engineering mind and the deeply human experiences he had endured. Ayan started sketching the framework for what would soon be known as Project Lighthouse, an internal meta-initiative meant to identify and support hidden tech talent from non-traditional backgrounds. But he didn't want it to be just another corporate diversity project where good intentions got buried beneath bureaucracy. This had to be real, tangible, scalable, and most importantly, led by people who had walked the path, not just read about it. He began by building what he called the Bridge, a mentorship program pairing experienced meta engineers with recruits from Lighthouse. But with a twist, The mentors were trained not just in coding languages, but in active listening, trauma-informed communication, and empathy-centered leadership. The goal wasn't just to make the new recruits better developers. It was to make the mentors better humans. Because Ayan believed something radical, that the act of lifting someone up was as transformational for the lifter as it was for the lifted. Within weeks, Project Lighthouse attracted attention. Mark made quiet visits to Ayan's office, sitting cross-legged on the floor as he listened to stories and watched prototypes come to life. There were no press releases, no flashy blog posts, just the quiet hum of something meaningful being built from the bottom up. Engineers who hadn't felt inspired in years were volunteering to be mentors. Team leaders who had once dismissed non-traditional applicants began opening doors. And slowly, word began to spread outside the company's walls. One afternoon, Ayan met with a young man named Theo. He was 19, recently emancipated from the foster system, and worked as a dishwasher in a bar downtown. He had never set foot on a college campus, but he had built a chatbot that could carry on a full conversation in 3 languages, using a second-hand Chromebook and free public Wi-Fi. As Theo sat across from Ayan in the same office where this all began, eyes wide and hopeful, Ayan saw his younger self reflected back at him, not the polished Stanford grad he once was, but the boy who stayed up all night trying to figure out how to fix things for the people he loved. "I'm not sure. I belong here," Theo mumbled. "You belong exactly here," Ayan replied without hesitation. "The world just hasn't caught up to that truth yet." The program wasn't without its challenges. There were skeptics, critics, some inside Meta, others outside. A few executives questioned the return on investment. Some engineers worried about lowering hiring standards. Others saw it as a distraction from core business priorities. But Mark stood firm. He had seen the fire in Ayan's eyes. He had felt the resonance of real impact. And he believed that Lighthouse wasn't just a charity project. It was a business imperative. A bet on untapped genius. The breakthrough came 6 months into the program. One of the Lighthouse recruits, a soft-spoken woman named Priya, who had previously worked as a long-haul truck driver, submitted a code patch that radically improved the performance of Meta's recommendation engine, the same engine that touched billions of users each day. Her solution? An optimization method she developed while tracking fuel efficiency routes across thousands of miles. Real-world experience had translated into revolutionary insight. That single breakthrough was enough to silence the doubters, at least for a while. But Ayan didn't celebrate with fanfare. He simply printed out Priya's code, pinned it to his wall, and got back to work. Because for every Priya, there were hundreds more like her, waiting for a chance, waiting for someone to believe. Lighthouse grew, so did its reach. Partnering with NGOs, community centers, and grassroots coding collectives, Ayan and his team expanded the program across 5 cities, then 10. They hosted workshops not in tech hubs, but in libraries, shelters, and cafeterias. They brought the mountain to Mohammed. And slowly, the numbers began to speak for themselves. Retention rates soared, engagement metrics improved. Teams reported not just better performance, but better morale. Empathy, it turned out, was a force multiplier. Mark, watching all of this unfold, knew they had tapped into something profound, something that went beyond algorithms and devices. They were rewriting the very definition of what it meant to be qualified. And Ayan, the man who once walked away from Meta to serve his family, had returned not just as an engineer, but as an architect of human potential. But for all the progress, Ayan knew one thing with certainty. This was only the beginning, because the world was still full of unknown coders in unknown kitchens, dreamers scrubbing dishes, geniuses wearing aprons, and he wouldn't rest until every single one of them had a door they could walk through. When the spotlight finds you, Ayan never expected Project Lighthouse to stay hidden forever. From the beginning, he knew that anything powerful enough to change lives would eventually attract attention. Still, he had hoped that the mission might grow quietly, building roots beneath the surface, protected from the bright lights of scrutiny and the cold mechanics of publicity. But 6 months after Priya's code optimization sent ripples through the Meta infrastructure team, a journalist from a tech magazine caught wind of the story. What began as a quiet inquiry ballooned into a feature-length article that hit the internet like a thunderclap. The headline read, "From fast food to the future of AI, Meta's unlikely revolution." Within hours, Ayan's inbox overflowed with messages. Some were from executives, some from skeptical industry veterans, but the most powerful ones came from strangers, janitors who coded on napkins during lunch breaks, single parents teaching themselves machine learning at night, ex-cons building apps behind bars. And all of them asked the same thing in different words. Is there a place for someone like me? Suddenly, Lighthouse was no longer a secret. The article painted Ayan as a visionary, a rebel, a reformer. Mark was quoted calling the initiative the soul of the next chapter of Meta. Recruiters began citing Lighthouse during campus visits. Investors brought it up in quarterly meetings. And almost overnight, Ayan became something he had never asked to be, the face of a movement. But with visibility came a storm of complexity. Departments that once quietly supported the program now wanted oversight. Legal teams questioned every new partnership. Policy leaders demanded data on outcomes, while PR departments worried about the program's unpredictable narratives. What had once been a sanctuary for misfits and dreamers began to feel like another battlefield of red tape, where every choice had to be filtered through layers of approval. Ayan tried to keep the soul intact. He still mentored every new cohort personally, still answered emails at 2 a.m. from applicants who didn't know how to write resumes or navigate application portals. He sat in on coding interviews, not as a judge, but as a bridge between raw talent and formal systems. Yet slowly, he could feel the gravitational pull of bureaucracy tightening. Meetings stretched longer, presentations needed more polish. Risk assessments started replacing instinct. And the very magic that had birthed Lighthouse, the idea that people, not credentials, carried genius, began to feel at risk of dilution. The breaking point came during an executive roundtable when a senior VP casually suggested refining the Lighthouse admissions process to prioritize candidates with at least some formal education. "It'll help avoid future controversies," the VP said, "and maintain our credibility with external stakeholders." The words hit Ayan like ice water. He looked around the room and realized something deeply unsettling. Half the people there hadn't seen what he had seen. They hadn't stood in the back of a McDonald's with grease on their hands, trying to debug logic statements between fries. They hadn't mentored a homeless teen who built an augmented reality app from library Wi-Fi. To them, Lighthouse was an initiative, a line on a diversity report. Ayan felt his voice tighten, his heart quicken, but he kept it steady. "I understand the concern about external optics," he said carefully, "but let me be clear. The moment we decide that someone's struggle disqualifies them from innovation, we lose the very spirit of what we're building. If Lighthouse becomes about who looks good on paper, we might as well shut it down." There was a long silence. Mark was there. He didn't say much, just looked at Ayan with that same quiet fire in his eyes, the one that had led him to that McDonald's booth nearly a year ago. After the meeting, Mark pulled him aside and simply said, "Keep building, I've got your back." But Ayan knew now that the fight wasn't just about launching a program. It was about protecting a philosophy. So he doubled down. He began hosting Fireside Fridays, a weekly open forum Zoom call where Lighthouse candidates and graduates could speak directly to Meta engineers, no matter their location, experience, or title. He shared stories without editing them for comfort. A man who coded through a hurricane in Puerto Rico, a girl from rural India who built an AI app to help farmers predict monsoons, a veteran who learned data science while battling PTSD. These weren't exceptions, they were the rule, if only the world had been willing to look. But not all reactions were positive. Critics on social media began questioning if Meta was using these stories for brand polishing. Others accused the company of exploiting vulnerable narratives. One blogger claimed Ayan was nothing more than a corporate puppet wrapped in a redemption arc. And even within Meta, some whispered doubts about whether he could keep the program afloat under the increasing weight of global scrutiny. For a few weeks, Ayan lost sleep. He questioned himself. He replayed old memories in his mind. His father, gasping in the hospital, his sister crying quietly with a brace wrapped around her spine, the McDonald's manager handing him a paycheck that barely covered rent. Was all of this worth it? Was he building something that could withstand the world's cynicism? Then, one evening, he received a handwritten letter delivered to his office. It had no return address, just a simple line on the front. "Thank you." Inside was a note from a Lighthouse graduate now working in Meta's AI accessibility team. She'd been mute since birth and had struggled to get hired anywhere because she couldn't participate in traditional interviews. Through Lighthouse, she was given the chance to present her ideas visually. Her tool, an AI-based speech recognition platform for the hearing impaired, had just been approved for Meta integration. The letter ended with this: "You believed I could speak before the world ever heard me." Ayan cried for the first time in years. That night, he sat alone in his office, the city lights glowing beyond the glass. He realized that movements don't begin when people notice you. They begin when you refuse to be unnoticed. And whether Lighthouse lasted one more year or 10, the seed had already been planted in thousands of minds around the world. That brilliance has no uniform, no pedigree, no perfect backstory. It just needs a chance, a crack of light, a whisper of belief. The next morning, he called Mark. "I need one more thing," he said. "Name it. I want to take Lighthouse global." The world is watching. The decision to take Project Lighthouse Global wasn't made in a boardroom. It wasn't sealed with a press release or tied to a fiscal quarter's strategy. It was made in a quiet phone call between two people, one who had built one of the world's most powerful companies, and the other who had rebuilt his life one shift, one bug fix, and one act of perseverance at a time. When Ayan said he wanted to go global, Mark didn't ask for projections or roadmaps. He didn't ask for KPIs or risk assessments. He simply said, "Let's do it, but do it your way." And so the next chapter of Lighthouse began, not with a strategy deck, but with a blank notebook. Ayan flew to Nairobi first, drawn by a non-profit that had been quietly training orphaned teens in Python and blockchain for years. Then to Bogotá, where a grassroots coding collective had sprung up in a hillside barrio using nothing but whiteboards and donated smartphones. From there, he moved through Jakarta, Mumbai, and a village outside Lahore, where a teenage girl had built a solar-powered laptop from recycled parts to teach herself JavaScript during rolling blackouts. Every place he visited, he didn't bring Meta hats or corporate banners. He brought a pen, a notepad, and a willingness to listen. The stories he found across these continents weren't all polished, and they weren't always easy to hear. In Dedu, Rio, he met a boy who coded while sleeping on a mattress beneath a freeway overpass. In Cairo, a former textile worker who had lost 3 fingers in a factory accident taught himself machine learning using only one hand and voice commands. These weren't sob stories. They were war cries of genius, suppressed not by ability, but by absence, of resources, of access, of belief. Ayan quickly realized that while talent was everywhere, infrastructure was not. So Lighthouse Global didn't start by handing out jobs. It started by listening to local leaders. It partnered with community centers instead of elite institutions. It provided refurbished laptops instead of overpriced certifications. It created a toolkit, a kind of open-source ecosystem for empowerment. Inside it were curriculum guides, virtual mentorship portals, storytelling templates for job interviews, and real case studies showing that non-traditional talent could not only integrate into high-stakes engineering teams, but lead them. Each new country added complexity. There were language barriers, unreliable electricity, social stigma, and in some places government suspicion. Yet for every obstacle, there was a local advocate ready to rise. People like Arti, a schoolteacher in Rajasthan who translated Lighthouse, coding lessons into Hindi during her lunch breaks, or Lemba in Ghana, who hosted evening seminars in his home, using a projector made from a cracked phone and a shoebox, or Omar in Istanbul, who launched a Lighthouse satellite group inside a refugee camp, giving displaced youth not just skills, but a reason to believe tomorrow could be different. Back in Menlo Park, the reaction was mixed. Some applauded the global expansion as visionary. Others questioned the return on investment. A few high-ranking voices began murmuring about mission drift, but the impact was hard to argue with. In less than 1 year, Lighthouse Global had launched 12 micro-hubs in 9 countries. Out of the first 300 participants, 178 had either been hired into Meta or referred to partner companies. Ayan, who had once worried whether anyone would believe in his mission, was now being invited to speak at summits and symposiums around the world. But fame had never been the goal. One night, after a long day of field visits in the Philippines, Ayan sat by a small fire outside a home in Cebu, drinking tea with a group of young women who had just completed their lighthouse immersion. One of them, only 17, shared how she had used her new skills to design an app that helped local fishermen track weather patterns and avoid dangerous storms. Another, a former domestic worker, had developed a digital literacy tool for rural families who had never touched a computer before. And as they laughed and shared stories in the warm flicker of firelight, Ayan felt something he hadn't felt since those lonely days in the back of McDonald's. Peace. Not the peace of success or security, but the deep, abiding peace that comes from knowing your pain had a purpose, that your scars weren't wasted. Still, the challenges continued to mount. With each success story came greater responsibility. Media outlets began circling, hungry for headlines. Politicians requested partnerships. Tech competitors sought to replicate the Lighthouse model, but stripped of its soul. Ayan was forced to walk a careful line, embracing the momentum without letting the mission get devoured by corporate machinery. That pressure came to a head when Meta's board proposed spinning Lighthouse off into a separate foundation, a philanthropic arm, technically separate from the main business. The idea was to protect Meta's core operations from the unpredictable nature of Lighthouse's growth. It sounded on paper like a good idea, but Ayan knew what it meant. It meant turning the program from an integrated belief system into a side project, a nice-to-have, a symbol, not a solution. So he made a decision that stunned even his closest allies. He declined the offer. In a passionate address to the board, Ayan said, "We didn't build Lighthouse to make Meta look good. We built it to prove that genius doesn't ask permission to be born in the right zip code. If we detach this program from the heart of our company, we're saying that this belief is optional. I didn't come back to Meta to run a charity. I came back to change the system from the inside." The board was divided. The media was watching. Investors held their breath, and Mark, once again, stood up not with a statement, but with a simple gesture. He moved Lighthouse from an experimental program into the very core of Meta's future talent strategy. Not a department, not a foundation, but a pillar. That single move sent shockwaves across Silicon Valley. Within weeks, other tech giants began auditing their hiring pipelines. Venture capital firms launched funds to support non-traditional founders. Universities began re-evaluating admissions policies. And in community centers from São Paulo to Soweto, young dreamers, once written off as invisible, were now being seen. Ayan, now older, wearier, but wiser, stood at the edge of the world he had once only dreamed of entering. He had walked through fire, not to find comfort, but to carry light for others. And now that light was multiplying, because when the world finally stopped to listen, it wasn't just the engineers who spoke. It was the janitors, the refugees, the mothers, the dishwashers. It was the man in the apron, and the world was listening. The code that lives on legacy is a strange word. In boardrooms, it's dressed in metrics tied to the number of patents filed, products launched, or quarterly growth curves bent upward. In biographies, it becomes a story polished for public admiration, framed by glossy photos and carefully crafted speeches. But for Ayan, legacy wasn't about recognition or reverence. It was about repetition. It was about how many people could take the idea he fought for and carry it forward, whether or not they ever knew his name. And now, as Project Lighthouse entered its third year, he found himself watching the most incredible shift of all. It was no longer his movement. It belonged to the people. It began subtly. A small team in São Paulo, made up entirely of Lighthouse graduates, launched a public API that translated basic AI commands into visual code blocks for learners with dyslexia. They didn't ask for permission or funding, they just built it. Then came a Lighthouse chapter in Nigeria that partnered with a solar company to create mobile coding kiosks in remote villages, powered entirely off-grid. Again, it wasn't orchestrated by Meta. It was sparked by students who had once needed help and now had become the help. Across the world, Lighthouse was becoming less of a program and more of a pattern of what happens when belief spreads faster than bureaucracy. Ayan traveled. Less now, not because he had grown tired, but because he had grown confident. He no longer needed to be in every room. In fact, the real success of Lighthouse lay in how often he wasn't needed. He watched, often from the quiet of his office, as leaders emerged from every direction. People who once hesitated to raise their voices were now hosting global webinars. Alumni were running innovation sprints, mentoring new cohorts, and leading panels in spaces that once excluded them. What had started as a bridge between overlooked talent and opportunity was becoming something much deeper, a transformation of how people defined value. Still, not everything came easy. There were programs that failed. There were candidates who dropped out. There were countries where government red tape slowed progress to a crawl. And then there was the backlash, fueled not just by ignorance, but by fear. A viral think piece accused Lighthouse of creating a shortcut economy, undermining traditional education. A prominent tech podcast questioned whether it was sustainable or just sentimental. Ayan read every critique carefully, not to defend himself but to refine the mission. He believed in friction, in resistance, because anything worth building must be tested not just by praise, but by fire. One of the most defining moments came not from a headline, but from a quiet meeting in a village near Chiang Mai, Thailand. There, a young Lighthouse graduate named Vat had developed a system that allowed elderly artisans to digitize and sell their hand-woven crafts to international markets. What was remarkable wasn't the technology itself, but the humility with which Vat built it. When Ayan visited the small classroom where the project had started, he found the students sitting on mats, writing JavaScript on paper because there weren't enough working devices. Yet the pride in their voices, the sharpness of their logic, the creativity in their problem-solving, it all mirrored what he'd once seen in the most advanced meta labs. And in that moment, he realized something profound. Access to tech didn't equal access to talent. Talent was always there, waiting, brewing. It simply needed light. That night, Ayan stood alone outside, staring up at a sky unpolluted by city lights. He thought about his father, long gone now, but whose quiet strength still lived in him. He thought about his sister, who had recovered and now worked as a social worker, guiding other families through hardship. He thought about the nights spent, cleaning grills at McDonald's, his mind split between surviving and dreaming. All of it had led here. And he wondered, not for the first time, whether we ever really build the future or whether we simply fight hard enough to let it arrive. Back at Meta headquarters, something else was happening. Lighthouse wasn't just inspiring global change, it was beginning to reshape the company from the inside. More than half of Meta's engineering interns in the latest cycle came from Lighthouse cohorts. Teams that had once hesitated to work with non-traditional recruits now openly requested them. And most notably, the company's leadership program, the same one Ayan had once failed to qualify for, was now co-led by Lighthouse alumni. They were writing internal playbooks, not just on code, but on inclusion, resilience, and empathy as operational strategy. Mark Zuckerberg, though always supportive, had deliberately kept a distance from the daily operations. But one afternoon, he asked Ayan to join him for a walk around the campus. It had been years since that first encounter at the McDonald's down the street. Now they strolled side by side, not as a CEO and an employee, but as collaborators in a quiet revolution. "You know," Mark said after a long pause, "I used to think the most valuable thing we could do was connect the world. But you showed me something else. What we build only matters if it includes the people who've been left out of every blueprint." Ayan smiled, but didn't respond immediately. There were no perfect words for the feeling in his chest, only a sense of motion, of direction, of something bigger than either of them. They stopped beneath a tree planted to commemorate Meta's 20th anniversary. A plaque nearby bore the names of early founders, major contributors, and architects of change. Mark glanced at it thoughtfully. "We're adding another plaque next year," he said. "It won't have your name alone. It'll have the names of the first 1,000 Lighthouse graduates. You built this, but they carried it forward." Ayan nodded. That, to him, was the real legacy. Not a statue, not a spotlight, but a constellation of lives lit from within, each one carrying the torch a little farther. In the months that followed, Lighthouse began preparing for its next phase, not as a project inside Meta, but as an open, global network accessible to any company, any institution, any learner. The systems had been built, the templates created, the flame lit. Now it was time to let it spread beyond the limits of one platform or one visionary. Ayan, ever the builder, was already sketching the next idea, one that involved embedding Lighthouse principles into early education systems before talent could be stifled by doubt or denied by poverty. But even as he looked ahead, he remained rooted in one truth: the most powerful thing you can give someone isn't knowledge or even opportunity. It's belief that their story matters, that their struggle is not their disqualification, but their credential, that they do not have to wait to be chosen. They already are. The light that remains. Years had passed, not in bursts of triumph, nor in headlines, but in the quiet evolution of a movement that had long outgrown its founder. Project Lighthouse had now spread to over 40 countries. It no longer existed as a singular program, but as an ecosystem, one that thrived in public schools, local non-profits, corporate partnerships, and autonomous hubs started by graduates who had taken the philosophy and made it their own. Ayan, now approaching his mid-40s, had transitioned out of the daily grind of leadership, not because he had grown tired, but because the work no longer needed to orbit around him, and that was the greatest proof of its success. The transition was never announced. There was no farewell speech, no press release. One morning, Ayan simply chose to step back. He cleared his calendar of strategy calls and keynote requests, handed over full operational authority to a diverse council of Lighthouse alumni, and returned to the work he had always loved most: mentoring. Not in a structured, hierarchical way, but in intimate, often anonymous ways. He would show up at workshops in Nairobi, Manila, or Detroit, sit quietly in the back of a dusty classroom or digital boot camp, and simply listen. Sometimes he'd speak, sometimes not, but always he would leave behind a handwritten note to someone who needed to hear that they were seen. And still, the program grew. It was on one of those quiet visits in a small urban community lab in New Jersey that Ayan met Layla, a 17-year-old high school student who had been raised by her grandmother after her parents were lost to addiction. Layla had been in and out of foster care before landing in a Lighthouse partner program at a local community center. She coded in silence, rarely speaking during group sessions. But her algorithm spoke for her, precise, elegant, often built from patterns she observed in nature: bird migrations, river tides, the folding of leaves. Ayan saw it instantly, not just the skill, but the shape of her mind. It was a shape he recognized because it was his own, curved not by textbooks, but by survival, sharpened not by privilege, but by necessity. He began mentoring her quietly, through email exchanges, through annotated lines of code, through short letters, each one signed only with the initial A. He never mentioned his full name, never referenced his role in Meta or Lighthouse. For Layla, A was simply a mystery mentor, someone who believed in her when no one else did. Someone who pushed her to think bigger, to build not for validation, but for impact. And through that encouragement, Layla went on to create a groundbreaking data visualization tool that helped cities predict and reduce youth homelessness by mapping abandoned properties, unused government funds, and volunteer networks. The tool caught attention, not from the tech world first, but from social workers and city planners. It wasn't sleek, it wasn't optimized for monetization, but it was saving lives. And when Meta eventually discovered its origins and invited Layla to present at their annual developer summit, she stood on that stage, trembling but radiant, and said something that would echo long after the applause faded. "I was never taught that I mattered, but someone believed it anyway, and that changed everything." In the front row, Ayan sat unnoticed, no badge, no introduction, just a quiet smile and eyes filled with tears. After her presentation, she finally met him in person. She stared in disbelief. You're the one. You're A." He nodded. "I just nudged what was already there." She shook her head. "No, you reminded me it wasn't too late to start. You reminded me to stay in the room." That phrase, "stay in the room," had become the unofficial motto of Lighthouse. It wasn't coined by a marketer or a strategist. It came from one of Ayan's first letters to a discouraged applicant many years ago. It read, "No matter how hard it gets, how invisible you feel, how loud the voices get telling you to give up, please just stay in the room, because the moment you leave, the world loses something it didn't even know it needed." Now those words were printed on the walls of coding centers across continents. They were stitched into backpacks, inscribed on bracelets, echoed in rally cries and keynote stages. But they lived most deeply in the hearts of those who once thought they had no place in the room at all. Mark, too, had changed. Watching Lighthouse evolve had reshaped his understanding of leadership. He often referred to it now not as a program, but as Meta's soul engine, the internal force that reminded the company why it built anything at all. In one particularly emotional address, he said, "Our greatest innovation wasn't virtual reality, it was human reality. Seeing people, truly seeing them, is the most transformative act of all." Eventually, a documentary was made, titled The light we carried. It didn't focus on Ayan, but on the lives Lighthouse had touched. A sanitation worker turned UX designer, a war refugee turned robotics researcher, a mother of 5 who created the first AI caregiver assistant in her region. The film won awards, but more importantly, it ignited movements in other industries: finance, healthcare, education. Other sectors began to adopt the Lighthouse model, tailoring it to their own invisible talent pools. The ripple had become a wave, and Ayan? He returned one evening to that same McDonald's where everything began. The place looked different now, modernized, digital kiosks, brighter lighting. But in the corner booth, the one near the window, he sat with a cup of black coffee, watching as a new generation walked by. Some in uniforms, some in hoodies, some with earbuds in, the world at their fingertips but still unaware of their own power. A young man behind the counter caught his eye. He moved with care, precision, and quiet leadership, helping customers, guiding younger workers, fixing a jammed printer without fuss. Ayan smiled. It was all there again. The eyes, the posture, the potential, and for a brief second, time folded. He saw himself all those years ago with the weight of a family on his shoulders and a dream tucked under his arm. He saw the man Mark had noticed, the one who never stopped building, and he knew in that moment that nothing truly ends. Light doesn't vanish, it passes on. He stood, left a note on the tray, and walked away without a word. On the note, written in neat handwriting, were 3 simple lines. "I see you. You already have what it takes. Just stay in the room."